Good evening. Good evening. My name is Paul Sandman. I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees here at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I am delighted to welcome you to what will surely be a very timely and engaging panel discussion. We are now just 20 days away from an election that promises far-reaching ramifications for our country. And while it is certainly unlike any election in our recent memory, do you wonder whether it is really as unusual as the media would have us believe? The MHS, through its collections, programs, and exhibitions, is in a unique position to offer historical perspective and to encourage a deeper understanding of our nation's history and its relevance to our everyday lives. This evening, our panelists will look back in time to explore 4 previous presidential elections and the periods of tumult that surrounded them. As our interlocutor this evening, we are fortunate to have historian, author, librarian, presidential speechwriter, and MHS trustee, Ted Widmer. Ted is a senior fellow at the Watson Institute at Brown University and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs in New York. Earlier this month, he was appointed director of the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. He also writes a monthly column about history for the Boston Globe called Hindsight. Ted's wide-ranging career spans the worlds of academia, politics, and journalism. He is the author or editor of many historical treatises, including a book published this month, The New York Times, Disunion, A History of the Civil War. A forthcoming book to be released next year is Lincoln on the Verge, an odyssey by rail. Before I turn things over to Ted, I also want to remind you that we have a large number of additional terrific programs coming up at the MHS this fall. These include 2 additional segments of our Presidents and Politics series. And on November 17th, we invite you all to Revolutionary Portraits from the Collections of the MHS. This will be a festive reception featuring presentations by Erica Hirschler of the MFA and David Dieringer of the Athenaeum. There are also brown bag lunch presentations, seminars, and other gallery talks and programs being offered. I encourage you to take another look at our calendar, and I hope to see you here often. Now I invite you all to enjoy the evening as I turn things over to Ted.
Thank you so much, Paul. Can you hear me all right? I'm delighted to be moderating this event. I'm delighted not to be moderating the debate you'll be hearing. That's at 9, as you all know. We're going to try to take about an hour exactly so you can all get home and see the debate, and we'll speak for about half an hour. We want to have a lot of audience interaction, so we'll save about 30 minutes for Q&A after we've all spoken. Full disclosure requires me to tell you I have worked for one of the 2 presidential candidates. I will not tell you which one. I worked for both this candidate and this candidate's spouse a long time ago. Feels like a very different era. It's a strange election, to put it mildly. My son is able to vote for the first time, and he said to me the other day, it feels already like we all lost. And there is something a little sad about this election. It's certainly sad. I want to stay away from any expression of partisan sympathy, but I have noticed a lot of irregularities, to put it mildly, in this election. I feel like we already know Well, let me knock on wood. I don't even think this is wood, but I'm knocking on it anyway. I think we know the likely winner, but I think we also know that this will be a hollow victory because resistance in Congress will be very severe. The forces that are already out there denying the validity of the democratic process, we've all heard them, and they will only be amplified in the weeks and months that will follow November 8th. There's a tiny thought in the middle of all that, but it has turned into a large fear that is not very, very much based on thought or facts. The thought is, the fact is that there's a small precinct in Philadelphia where in 2012, Mitt Romney failed to win a single vote. And this is a precinct in a heavily African-American neighborhood of Philadelphia. And so it's that fact, which apparently is true, and the Philadelphia Inquirer has been trying to look into it and has sent reporters, and they have yet to find a person who actually voted for Mitt Romney or who will admit to have voted for Mitt Romney in 2012. And that fact, unfortunately, lends itself very well to conspiracy theories. And so we've been hearing a lot of them in Pennsylvania especially, and I think that fear will only be amplified, as I said, in the weeks to come. Other irregularities, they happen on a daily basis, and I'm sure we will see them in a few hours. The extraordinary fact of the leaders of a foreign nation, not just any nation, Russia, hacking into the email of a candidate from a major party and revealing the contents of high-level campaign strategy. Serious plagiarism in a convention speech that was a big scandal for about 24 hours and was completely forgotten afterwards. A major candidate running not only against his opponent, but in many ways against his own party. That's what's really strange about this election, is that Donald Trump, now I've said a name of a candidate, is running nearly as much against the Republican establishment as against the Democratic establishment. It's very confusing. It's a strange situation in Washington, where I have just moved, where it's very hard to find an elected official, especially at the state level, a governor, but also it's a little hard to find senators from the Republican Party who enthusiastically endorse the Republican Party's nominee. That is strange in our history. And then the things that we hear on a daily, weekly basis, I won't repeat all of them. You know them all because we hear them at such loud volume all day long, but that his rival was using performance-enhancing drugs in the last debate, that she is part of one conspiracy or another, that her husband's problems of 20 years ago are a serious fact in the current election, that if elected, he will be holding a meeting with Vladimir Putin before his inauguration. So it's just we're in a time that is somewhat off the known map of politics as we've experienced it in the last, going all the way back to the beginning. And that is the purpose of our evening tonight, is to restore a sense of balance. And I'm hoping that history will provide a small comfort by allowing us to realize how dysfunctional we've been at many, many moments in the past. Henry Adams, looking at Ulysses Grant, said the progress from George Washington to Ulysses Grant was a serious argument against Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which was contemporary. And I can't even imagine what Henry Adams or what John Adams would be saying right now. I work at Brown University, or I have worked there for the last 10 years, and I had lunch with Gordon Wood a few weeks ago, and we talked about all this, and it goes without saying that the founders would be troubled. Gordon just said, they really didn't like democracy very much. We hear the word democracy so much that we it has lost some of its specificity of meaning. And Gordon said, what's notable in the Constitution and in the early system is not so much the expression of democracy, but all of the brakes upon democracy. And they were numerous. And even Thomas Jefferson, who did so much to ease up pressure on those brakes, was troubled at the end of his life in the 1820s by the rise of Andrew Jackson and the volcanic forces that Andrew Jackson seemed to be able to command at will. And in the lead up to this event, with the curators and I had a very lively discussion about which elections in the past we ought to cover. And 1824 was a serious candidate, and so was 1800. But I commend the staff of the MHS for really wanting to bring us into recent history. And so they have assembled an all-star panel, and we will each speak for a few minutes, three to 5 minutes, about a particular election. We'll talk a little bit amongst ourselves, and then we'd like to open it up to Q&A from all of you. So to my immediate left, Carol Bundy will talk about the election of 1860. It brought us Abraham Lincoln. She's a long-term friend of the Society. She is a Cambridge resident. She's a very good friend of mine. She's the author of the book, The Nature of Sacrifice, a biography of Charles Russell Lowell about her great-great-great-uncle, and the moral issues underpinning a young man's decision to fight in the Civil War. To her left is Lisa McGiir, who will talk about the election of 1928. Lisa's a professor of history at Harvard University. She teaches in a wide range of 20th century topics. Her first book was Suburban Warriors, The Origins of the New American Right. Her most recent book is The War on Alcohol, Prohibition, and the Rise of the American State. And to her left is Michael Cohen, who's a regular contributor to the Boston Globe on national politics and foreign affairs. He will talk about 1968, and he's the perfect person because he has a book on that election called American Maelstrom, the 1968 election and the politics of division. And we were going to have James Patterson, who is a professor emeritus of history at Brown University, who was going to talk about 1952, but he had a very bad back injury and he can't be here. But he asked me to talk about 1952, so I'm going to be a pinch hitter from Brown University for Jim Patterson. But if I can turn things over to Carol, we'll go back to the election that gave us Abraham Lincoln.
Okay, so in 3 minutes, the election of 1860. So I guess one of the things you need to know about the election of 1860 is that throughout the 1850s, the country was in a stalemate and the government had sort of ceased to function. The failure of the legislative branch, you're not hearing me? So the failure of the 1850s to resolve the issues of the day is part of the background to the election of 1860. The legislative branch, with the Compromise of 1850, had undone the deals made in the early years of the century and created a free-for-all in the territories over whether there would be a slave or state. And that had really set micro-civil wars going on in Kansas, and they are the precursor to things to come. In the judicial branch, the Dred Scott case, which defined the African American as not a human being. That was the definitive decision that said they were property and would remain property wherever they were, and could be returned to be property even if they had achieved freedom. So by 1860, you have an election for president in which the Democratic Party splits, and you have a northern candidate, Stephen Douglas, and you have a southern candidate, John Breckinridge. You have the embers of the Whig Party, now calling itself the Constitutional Union Party, with John Bell as their candidate. And you have this new party, the Republican Party. It had a candidate in the 1856 election, John Fremont, but it is in the 1860 election that Abraham Lincoln is elected president only because you have this four-way split. And so this new party is able to elect a candidate to the presidency. And immediately, the South begins to secede, so that by the time of his inauguration, you already have the core of the South in secession. And that's sort of the failure of the executive branch. And by, what is it, a week or 10 days after his inauguration, you have the Civil War beginning. So is that 3 minutes? I think that,
Yes.
but I think that helps you to see the dysfunctional election, a dysfunctional government, and the inability of the country to resolve any of its issues.
All right, Lisa McGiir.
Okay, so briefly, in a very, very, very brief nutshell, the election of 1928 is an election that I think is really interesting and resonant in terms of some of the issues that are relevant for the election today. So 1928 was, of course, the moment in which Al Smith, who had been the four-time governor of New York, was an Irish American and a Catholic, ran for election as the head of the Democratic Party ticket against Herbert Hoover, who was a kind of progressive social engineer and a Protestant Quaker. The election was dominated by what one could term, what many historians have termed ethnic cultural issues, but I would actually argue were issues that were deeply sort of nativist, anti-immigrant, and also this was embedded around the issue of alcohol prohibition, which had been in place for 8 years and became a very, very prominent issue in the election because it was, for immigrants and for Catholics, a symbol, a very concrete symbol through legislation of all they opposed about nativism. And Al Smith championed anti-alcohol legislation. He was opposed to prohibition, so he became the standard bearer for a prohibition opposition. And as a result of that, he galvanized immigrant ethnic urbanites within the Democratic Party, really for the first time as a solid bloc. And so this was a moment of electoral realignment. And because of that galvanization of those ethnic immigrants within the Democratic Party bloc, and because of Al Smith at the head of the Democratic Party ticket, there was an enormous amount of vitriol and hostility that was mobilized within the Republican Party. The party, remember, the Republican Party was not the Republican Party of today. It was a party which included Jane Addams and, at that time, Harold Ickes and Robert La Follette, and many who were progressives. So the party was kind of split between a progressive and a very sort of nativist dry wing. But in 28, because Smith was the head of the Democratic Party ticket, the Protestant church really mobilized in the political process in a very major way. And the vitriol and sort of bigotry of the election was remarked upon by many. And I'm going to give you one quote, which will help to situate this in terms of today, and to understand that perhaps, you know, some of the language and the discourse is not quite as unprecedented as we often think. So Francis Perkins, who many of you may know, who was a very prominent figure within the New Deal, was also sort of present in Democratic Party politics in 28, remarked that some of the most terrible, fantastic prejudices and dreadful yarns I have ever heard occurred during the election of 28. And Lillian Wald, a leader in the Settlement House movement, remarked that she was in despair over the organized bigotry, the likes of which I have never seen. I feel as if some poison gas has spread over us, and you may feel the same way with this election, has spread over us, and that our democracy will suffer from this for many years to come. Now, that should give us some hope. Because, in fact, this was an election which helped lead us to the New Deal and to a really significant, important moment of realignment where those nativist issues really disappeared in many ways for a particular moment of time in any case. So democracy is resilient. It is dysfunctional, and you know these issues pop up. Nativism, white nationalism, they occurred in 28. The Ku Klux Klan was mobilized in that election against Smith and all of his supporters, they are appearing again. But I would suggest that there is also cause for hope, that perhaps we don't need to fear that this is going to be devastating for our democracy in the long term. At least that's my hope.
Thank you.
Or more than 3
Thank
minutes,
you
perhaps.
for the optimism. It's nice to have that. Well, Jim Patterson sent me a few pages of notes, which I'll summarize rather than read, but he was going to talk about the 1952 election, which, as I think you all know, pitted Adlai Stevenson, governor of Illinois, against Dwight D. Eisenhower, a newcomer to politics, but very famous as the commanding general of Allied forces in the European theater of World War II. Eisenhower won in a landslide. He won 55 to 45, and the election really wasn't close at all, but there are interesting things that came out of it. First, it demonstrated glaringly the power of anti-communism as a political force in this country, whipped up by partisan Republicans who found it a very effective way to criticize Harry Truman's administration for its weakness as they saw it in the Cold War, the loss of China, Russia's development of an atomic weapon. Richard Nixon, the young California congressman first and then senator who was chosen as Eisenhower's running mate, was chosen because he was such an effective spokesman against communism. He charged, among other things, that Adlai Stevenson had a PhD from Dean Acheson's Cowardly College of Communist Containment. It's not a very good soundbite. It's quite hard to say. But I don't want to linger on that fact because I'm sitting next to the granddaughter of Dean Acheson. Eisenhower rose above that, but not as high as we might have liked. And there was a famous episode that was later told by many historians in Wisconsin, the home state of Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican senator, but he had been a Democrat before that. And Eisenhower was going to Wisconsin and planned in a speech that had been distributed to the press so everyone could read the words to strongly defend General George Marshall, whom McCarthy was beginning to include in his roundup of people who were soft on communism, which really raised the ire of anyone who had ever worked with George Marshall. And of course, Eisenhower had. Marshall had promoted him over himself to be the supreme commander in World War II. And in one of the few missteps of Eisenhower's very successful political career, he did not speak the words that he had written praising General Marshall. And so later biographers of Eisenhower have looked at that moment as a moment that he might have performed better. At the same time, Eisenhower did generally rise above that kind of anti-communist rhetoric, and as we all know, served for two quite successful terms as president between 1953 and 1961. 1952 was also a fascinating election for its very widespread use of television, which was a powerful force, but not yet a well understood force. And Adlai Stevenson, though articulate, obviously did not understand what TV was because he gave long, and Jim wrote, and boring 30-minute speeches clinging tenaciously to the issues, which a serious mistake in a presidential campaign. Eisenhower was much smarter, and by the way, his campaign was managed by Henry Cabot Lodge II here in Massachusetts, and he worked with Madison Avenue ad executives and gave a series of 28 folksy 30-second spots that were timed to follow TV shows like I Love Lucy. And everything Eisenhower did was smart, friendly, warm, and folksy, and it worked very well. There was one other moment in '52 when TV was extremely important, and that was when Richard Nixon got into trouble for accepting $18,000 in private donations from Republican donors. And it should be said that those donations were entirely legal. And Adlai Stevenson had accepted similar donations, but it was turned into a very effective political attack against Richard Nixon, and he was on the verge of being dropped by Eisenhower, and he went on TV and gave the famous, long, emotional, somewhat maudlin, and self-pitying Chequers speech in the exact style that we later became very familiar with. And it was an enormous, enormous success. And letters came in 75-1 supporting Richard Nixon, and Eisenhower embraced him. And Nixon was fine, and we had a whole lot more of Richard Nixon later in American history. In other ways, I looked up this election a little bit on my own today. It was interesting inside each party. In the Republican Party, there was a more bitter contest than I first understood between Robert Taft, the senator from Ohio, and Eisenhower. Eisenhower really came in as an outsider to politics, much like Donald Trump. And for someone who was later criticized pretty effectively as not being all that intellectual by John F. Kennedy when he ran in 1960, Eisenhower was president of Columbia University, and he and Woodrow Wilson are the only two people at anything like that level of intellectual achievement to run successfully for the presidency. Usually to have a PhD, as Nixon knew, or to be a university president is a disadvantage at that level of American politics. Taft ran very strong against Eisenhower, and the convention was an unhappy convention in which the forces did not like each other. But Eisenhower prevailed and worked with the Taft supporters to unite the party afterwards. And on the Democratic side, it was interesting. Adlai Stevenson won, but he was very hesitant. He took a long time. He infuriated Harry Truman for his indecisiveness. And he had a strong competitor in Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, who was also very good on TV. He'd been using the anti-corruption hearings on TV to bolster his image. But in that era when party bosses were very strong, they didn't like Estes Kefauver precisely because he'd gone after organized crime so effectively, and organized crime was a pretty important group of supporters of Democratic Party bosses back then. So anyway, it was complicated on each side, as it always is, and that's the story of 1952. Michael?
This year I recognize that this year seems like a really crazy political year, maybe the craziest one we've ever seen. But allow me just to do a brief reminder of what happened in 1968 in this country. So the year begins, there are 500,000 American troops fighting a war in Vietnam. At the end of January, there's a massive, I should add that at the beginning of the year, Americans had been told by their president and by the Supreme Commander in Vietnam, William Westmoreland, that there was a light visible at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam. At the end of that month, there was a massive Viet Cong and North Vietnamese offensive that burst any notion that the war was coming close to an end. And this fed the insurgent campaign of Gene McCarthy, who was challenging Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination. In New Hampshire in mid-March, he won 42% of the vote, almost defeated Johnson. Complete shocking victory, or shocking achievement, even though he didn't win. Several days later, Bobby Kennedy, the brother of the president slain in 1963 and who Johnson replaced as president, announces that he is now challenging Johnson for the Democratic nomination. Several days after that, Nelson Rockefeller, who had run for president in 60 and 64, sort of run in 60, more visibly ran in 64, announces that he is not going to challenge the Republican nomination. This came a few weeks after George Romney had dropped out of the race to challenge the frontrunner Richard Nixon. About 10 days later, Lyndon Johnson speaks to the country, and in an announcement that maybe 10 people knew in advance, announces that he will not be seeking the Democratic nomination for president. That's March, okay? 4 days after that happened, and I should add that after Johnson drops out of the race, there's this moment, brief moment of optimism in the country. People think, well, maybe we've gotten past the tumult of this year and of the past several years. And of course, 4 days later, Reverend Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, leading to riots in many major American cities. In fact, the most sustained period of violence in American society since the Civil War. 2 months after that, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated in California after winning the California primary. 2.5 months after that, you have riots, police riot to be more specific, in Chicago, the Democratic Convention. And meanwhile, you have a third-party candidate named George Wallace running on a segregationist and racist platform who wins 13% of the vote and is the last third-party candidate to win an electoral vote in a presidential election. And you end up then with Richard Nixon being elected president. So I would say that 68, if you want to talk about crazy years, that this year cannot really hold a candle to 1968, I would argue. Now, that alone would make 68 an incredibly fascinating year. But to me, what makes 68 interesting is the ultimate impact of it. And so there's a couple things, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but I think the critical things that come out of this year is, first and foremost, you see both parties end up moving more to their political extremes. So Republicans become more conservative, Democrats move more to the left, particularly in foreign policy. This increases the level of polarization in American politics. The more homogenous the two parties become, the more polarization you have, and certainly that is the case today. And I think this process begins in 68. Racial polarization, which we've become very used to in this country, in a situation in which the Republican Party basically is the white party in this country, and the Democratic Party is a multicultural party. This begins actually in 64, in which Barry Goldwater gets less than 10% of the black vote, largely because opposition to civil rights. In 68, again, Humphrey wins about 90% of the African American vote. Richard Nixon gets less than 10%, and 8 years earlier, he'd gotten about 32% of the African American vote. This racial polarization is actually seen by Republicans as a positive for them. It's addition by subtraction, they see it. And it's the polarization of two parties on race becomes a huge, a dividing point between the two parties, and I think we've seen how significant of a dividing point that is in this election. And I think, perhaps more than anything else, you see the end of the New Deal coalition and the emergence of this sort of anti-government conservative populism that becomes sort of the dominant mantra in American politics. And I think creates a lot of the dysfunction that you see in American politics today, a lot of the disinclination to expand government in any significant way. You see more skepticism toward the role of government, something that gathers more steam with Watergate. But I think really what you see out of 68 are these incredible divisions, these divisions on race, on class, on social issues, on cultural issues. And to my mind, when I first started working on this book on 68, I remember this quote I'd come across in 2004. It was an anonymous quote in the Wall Street Journal of a White House aide, who I assume was Karl Rove, saying about John Kerry and how he would try to run against Bush. He said, "It's never stopped being 1968 for Democrats." And what he meant by that was that the issues of weakness on foreign policy that kind of came out to the fore in 68 were ones that still trapped Democrats. It turned out that year to be correct in 2004. But I would argue that in some ways we're still sort of caught in the divisions that began to emerge in 68, the racial divisions, the cultural divisions. And I think in some ways, this election between a candidate who is eerily reminiscent of George Wallace, I think sort of shows how much the politics of 68 continue to divide us and continue to dominate the nation's politics. So on that incredibly positive note, let's get to the questions.
Well, thanks to all the panelists. 1968 was being talked about at the time of the Republican convention, and there were echoes in the law and order rhetoric. Now I feel like we've sort of gone just into uncharted territory with no historical reference. But did you feel at the time of the convention that, so you just said Wallace is audible in some of Donald Trump's speeches, but do you hear Nixon in there also?
So the thing on law and order is that I think it's hard to remember this, and I didn't mention this in my opening remarks, but crime increased exponentially in the 60s. It increased from 62 to 68 in a very dramatic way. There were legitimate fears about crime. There had been riots pretty much every single year, major riots. In 67, you had Newark and you had Detroit. You had the Watts riot in 65. These were riots in which the 101st Airborne, 82nd Airborne was called out to patrol the streets of major American cities. And so talking about law and order then from Richard Nixon, people always portray it as a racial dog whistle. And in some ways it was, but in some ways actually it was a legitimate response to rising crime rates. When Donald Trump talks about it, it resonates with his supporters, I don't think many other people, because the fears of crime are nowhere near the same today as they were then. And so I think in that sense, it's part of Trump's problem in the sense that his message is tailored to a very narrow group of Americans, namely Republicans, who are conservative and who are nativist and who are, many of whom are racist and many of whom are xenophobic, and who find Trump's message appealing. The problem Trump has had, and the problem he's had since last year, is that nobody else really finds that message appealing. And that's kind of why he's losing. For Richard Nixon's case, he didn't run his racist campaign, didn't run his nativist campaign, ran a campaign actually that was much more, attempted to be much more unifying. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true, than people remember. It's one of the reasons why he was successful. In fact, if I can just make one last point, that Nixon, the biggest parallel I see between Nixon in '68 and today is actually Hillary Clinton. You have two relatively unpopular status quo politicians who are basically running their campaigns against their opponents, as opposed to running sort of more positive aspirational campaigns. They're running against their opponents. In '68, it was Nixon running against Johnson and Humphrey. This year, it's running against Trump.
One other legacy of '68 is the McGovern Commission that rewrote the rules for Democrats to be nominated, because it had been so bad for Democrats in 1968 that they wanted to get away from people like Boss Richard Daley in Chicago and give more power to the people, but however that is expressed. And that led to much more of a primary-based system, right, that began with the Democrats and ironically nominated George McGovern in 1972. I remember, as I'm sure many of you do, the bumper stickers you saw all over Massachusetts in 1973. Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts. But the primary system also became very important for Republicans, and in a way, Donald Trump succeeded brilliantly by outperforming more established Republican politicians through the primaries, which leads to the question, are the primaries a little bit out of control, and were we better organized when we had party bosses keeping a lid on everything? And do any of my panelists want to try to handle that one?
Well, I think if you go back to the election of 1860, what you had was a country that was so polarized that the parties could not hold together. And I think we've all brought up moments where the parties were undergoing massive realignment for reasons that extend far beyond the protocol of the parties. So what you're really, I think what we're really seeing are sort of seismic shifts. The coalition that that flourished under the New Deal collapses by 1968 with the Civil Rights Act, and a massive, and that realignment is now falling apart. And there is this opportunity for a third party to emerge, or at least for a wing of a party to splinter off in a way that then causes realignments. If Trump takes the more conservative populist, there is sort of an opportunity now for the sort of muffled liberal wing of the Republican Party to rise up, which would then allow the Democrats to become more progressive than they have been. So you could see realignments, and so that's really my point, is that I think it's more than the parties redefining themselves.
Do you think there will be a correction to Trump, assuming he loses, which we can't assume? I'm still confused because I see in the New York Times that funny statistic every day of it's around 89% likelihood of Hillary winning. But then you look at state by state, it's a very narrow margin. She's up by, it's very narrow. It's an astonishing criticism of her, basically, that she's winning by as small a margin as she is. That's something we might talk about too, is what is wrong on the Democratic side.
Actually, I gotta I'm gonna say, I think I disagree with that, because I think you look at how polarized this country is. She's gonna win by double digits, I think. She's gonna win by a huge margin. If you think about how polarized this country is right now, how few swing voters there are, to win by that much is extraordinary. Now, I'm not gonna argue she's winning that much because because of people enthusiasm for her, although that's part of it. She's winning in large measure because Trump is basically, for most Americans, simply unfathomable as president. But let me just say, if she wins by, I mean, Obama won in 2008 by 7 points in the middle of an economic, basically, recession/depression. She'll probably win by more than that. In an era of polarization that we have now, that is actually rather surprising, I think.
Do you think on the Republican side, I mean, there's a lot of soul searching, and will the party leaders, whoever they are, and that's a question we might ask too, who controls the Republican Party right now, but will they shore up things? Will there be different kinds of primaries to prevent the emergence of an independent, sort of nonpartisan Republican like Donald Trump? Do any, like the opposite of the McGovern Commission? Will we see a sort of tightening up of the rules to make it harder for outsiders?
More super delegates on the Republican side.
Yeah.
I think it's, I think the question is really the Republican Party needs to address the fact that it's been ignoring its this base for a long time, the elite of the Republican Party. And, maybe the choice, I don't think it's going to work. In other words, I think there is a way in which they need to figure out themselves how they can, the party is so divided between this sort of dissatisfied, really ultra-conservative base, which they really have been very deeply dependent on, this elite group of Republicans who are all for deregulation and things that are hurting that base, that they need to, there's a kind of contradiction within the heart of the party, and it's a matter of I think they're going to have to sort of rethink the whole Republican Party agenda and what the identity of the party is.
But I think that's I think that's a really good point, that in '68, when Humphrey runs the nomination, he hasn't run a single primary. He never faces the voters. If Johnson had run in '68, he would have never faced the vote. He would have faced the primary. Even if he had lost, he still would have been the nominee of the party, because power brokers in the Democratic Party basically controlled who got the nomination. So it wasn't a democratic system. And I think, in a sense, that's part of the reason why Johnson and even to Humphrey didn't change their policy on Vietnam. They weren't being challenged within their own party to do so. I mean, Johnson could basically sail through and win the nomination, and so could Humphrey, without changing course on Vietnam, even though there was this mass dissension and mass revolt in the party against the war in Vietnam. And I think, to your point, I think it's exactly right that there is this sense of the Republican Party that the leadership of the party has not followed through on its promises. They didn't impeach Obama, they didn't repeal Obamacare, they didn't stop immigrants coming into the country. They couldn't do any of these things, but that doesn't really matter to Republican voters. So they feel betrayed. And I think the number one thing about this election that is, I think, often forgotten, that this election is fundamentally about a revolt within the Republican Party. It is about a sense of betrayal among Republican voters, an anger at the establishment, and Trump represents that anger. And that is why he won the nomination. It's not because he's a racist and nativist, although that certainly helped. It's because he's an anti-establishment figure in a party that is taken over by forces that are anti-establishment. And when you have a party like that, I do not know that there's any way to put it back together again. I think that the Republican Party is it cannot come together united in any real way, shape, or form in the near future.
Let me ask one last question in this format, and then we invite the audience to ask us questions for what I hope will be a lively conversation. But I want to say a couple nice things about Donald Trump, believe it or not. He's a very skillful user of social media. He figured out Twitter better than any other Republican and better than Hillary. I mean, whether you like what he's saying on Twitter or not, they're just coming nonstop. They're entertaining. I mean, he has turned politics into entertainment. It's very confusing. The camera loves him. The media, well, now I think they're aware of their own role in his rise. But in all of those Republican debates with 17 people on stage, the camera would just sort of drift over to him and let him talk. And it was a mutually reinforcing system. And I also want to say, I talked about irregularities earlier on the Republican side. Even if you don't like Donald Trump, I found it a little bit disturbing that the release of his tax records and the release of the famous Access Hollywood hot mic recording were leaks without attribution. We don't know where they came from. They were dirty tricks in politics. So Trump has a legitimate grievance against the establishment, which he's certainly milking for all it's worth. But going back to Twitter and social media, in what other elections have we seen a candidate just really master a new technology way faster than his opponent?
So Lincoln is probably one of the most photographed presidents of all time. And photography was that was the new medium, and it was felt that a photographic image could not lie at this point. Now I think we have a slightly different view about what a photograph can do. But in those days, it was the art medium of the people, of anybody. Anybody could afford to have a photograph taken of them. You could just go in and for a very modest amount of money, have your photograph taken, then you go hang about, have a beer somewhere and come back and pick up the developed image. And it is an image of you that is 100% reliable. So unlike a portrait, you are not glorified, you're not you're not turned into a version of yourself or a fantasy of yourself. So the photographs of Lincoln gave him a presence and a reality that Stephen Douglas never couldn't compare with. So yes, Lincoln got an edge by mastering that medium.
So I think there's always these moments, right? This is Nixon was elected in '68, but of course it's in '60 where you have that very, very famous debate, televised debate, where Kennedy simply was able to master sort of performative edge of being in that venue of national televised media really, really well, and that apparently was said to have an effect on a very close election. In 32 and 36, FDR was the master of the radio and the fireside chat, and that was huge. I mean, not that Hoover would have been able to win if he had mastered the radio, but nonetheless, I mean, it was important.
Ironically, Nixon had done so well with the Checker speech in '52 that he felt very good about
That's
TV.
right. Yeah.
And then it didn't work out so well for him.
But it's funny, in '68, he comes up with a strategy of less is more, in which he actually doesn't do a lot of events. He doesn't spend a lot of time, he doesn't go do 5 events a day. He does one major event a day on one theme, giving the media less, but basically giving media as little material as possible with stuff that actually positively shows Nixon. He also does these sort of fake town halls where he brings in questioners, ordinary people, to ask him questions that he's memorized the answers to. And he then comes across as being very statesmanlike and not being challenged, even though it looks like he's being challenged because he's being asked questions, but they're not hard questions, he knows the answers to them. So it sort of creates this appearance of sort of making him look presidential. But the one thing I will say that I think is interesting about '68 to today is how much the events of that year that shape people's understanding of politics, and it's because of what they saw on television. People could watch the riots at the DNC. They could, and when they watch the hall, inside the hall, the delegates, and then they'll look outside the hall and they'll see cops beating up hippies, and immediately the stain of what they saw outside was basically put on to the people who were inside, to the Democrats. And so I think, in a way, we've all been spectators to this bizarre spectacle of an election that has been on 24 hours a day, and for those of us who had to write about it, I think we're all like having PTSD from having to cover this thing. But it is amazing the extent, and now it's playing on social media and playing out on our Facebook feeds. But I do think that people's engagement in this election, it sort of mirrors that in '68. I think there's a certain a horror of watching a lot of what we're watching, but also a sense of we can't look away. It's like watching it's like rubbernecking at a car crash to some extent. I mean, that's what we're all doing tonight, right? No one expects to learn anything tonight. We're all just waiting to see what Trump's going to do.
All right, Carol, do we have a microphone for audience members? I'd love to hear from you. Although I mentioned earlier we're trying to suppress pure democracy, so we have no filters. Just let us have it. We'll do our best. Yep, right there in the center.
When you say thinking about this idea of Donald Trump as sort of an insurgent who, in effect, thinking about Donald Trump as, in effect, an insurgent who takes over the party. Andrew Jackson in 1824 comes to mind, Barry Goldwater in 1964. I'd love to hear your thoughts about those. Are there other examples of parties that were, in some sense, taken over by people who represented a new direction that party was going to have to figure out some direction to go in?
I mean, Goldwater is great. I think a great example. You know, when I think about Trump and the party's inability to hold on to control, it's very, very resonant of what happened in '64. When I think about all of the sort of business folks who are really traditionally Republican that are now moving over or thinking about moving over to support Hillary, that also happened in the election of '64 because there was just
Hillary
such a
supported Goldwater that election.
and Hillary supported Goldwater, ironically, yeah. But so the Republican Party at that moment really did similarly lose control, or had a sense of losing control to this insurgent kind of mobilized grassroots base within the party. And as a result of those politics, which today seem actually mainstream Republican, but at that moment were really out of line with what was a more moderate Republican Party, you know, went down to massive defeat, right? I mean, the party, Goldwater, lost massively. And in the wake of that, the Republican Party really rethought its strategies. They incorporated kind of conservatism of Goldwater, but in a more cautious way, and they tried to build bridges, and the result was really '68 and Nixon, which providing still a kind of populist conservatism, but in a much more kind of moderate, more, I guess, sort of palatable way for the broader electorate. So I think there is a lot of interesting kind of parallels one could draw out between those two moments.
In my brief study of 1952, I learned that Eisenhower, who we think of as the face of a kind of benign, very successful republicanism, was actually somewhat of an insurgent candidate against the powers of the party, and that he and Lodge organized groups around the country called Citizens for Eisenhower that were outside the political system and were in a way a predecessor for Goldwater in '64, and that those guys are the beginning of, and they begin to hear a bit some of the energy from even further to the right, including the John Birch Society, which is founded here in Massachusetts, surprisingly. And so even in what seemed like the heyday of two-party politics controlled by bosses, there were always these forces on the extremes.
But no, do you want to go ahead?
Just a quick little point to make, which is that in 1952, the Republicans had been out of power for 20 years? 20 years.
Yeah.
The Republicans had been out of power for 20 years. So you have that as the backdrop to why there was a certain loss of faith in the powers that were, so to speak, and the feeling that they needed to really pull out the stops.
If I just add one point, I mean, one thing I would say about Trump is I don't see Trump as an insurgent. I see he's an insurgent candidate, but he's on a continuum in the sense that the Republican Party has been running on racist and nativist tropes for 40-something years. And if you look at the primary, every single Republican candidate for president basically was anti-immigrant. They all wanted to ban Syrian Muslims. Trump just wanted to step further and said he wants to ban all Muslims. But there's something kind of odd about this campaign, in which basically you've had Republicans run on this racist, nativist tropes for years, and Republicans say, I can't believe we nominated a racist and nativist as our candidate for president. Well, guess what? I mean, this is kind of where this was logically leading to. And what I think this election has shown is that no matter how much you hear about ideological conservatists and people like Paul Ryan, the real base of the Republican Party is the nativist element, which Trump has been playing on for the last year.
Just briefly on 1824, that is a good parallel. A big messy election, a lot of people, and John Quincy Adams wins barely. He wins through Congress and his friendships in Congress. And one of the issues was he was married to a foreigner. And Carol was saying before this event started that in a sense, Louise Catherine Adams is the Melania Trump of her era. So there are always parallels. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir.
I haven't heard much about the Sanders revolt in the Democratic Party. So I'm just wondering what you all think about whether or not the Democrats will be in for a realignment if they ignore the message of the Sanders people.
So it's possible to. So this is a bit where I was earlier. I do think there are forces at work in the country that are expressing themselves in the election. That this isn't just a matter of electoral politics, and the way in which in the last 10 years our government has failed to resolve the issues that we have put before it, that we have a stalemate in Congress, and we also have a Supreme Court that many people feel has, it's interesting that you have the Dred Scott case in 1857, and now you have a Citizens United. In one case, it's saying that a human being is really a thing, and Citizens United is saying that a thing is really a person.
Is that progress? I'm not sure actually.
Well, the Citizens United is based on the 14th Amendment, right? So anyway, so this problem that we face, what happens when the legislative branch of government no longer functions? What happens when the Supreme Court is not actually resolving judicial cases? Obama has resorted to executive action, but that's very controversial. So I guess where I would end up is that the Bernie Sanders campaign represents the part of the Democratic Party or the left of the country that is as eager for action as the more conservative ends of the Republican Party, and this is all expressive of the enormous frustration in the country of not actually solving real problems. That will have to, there's something we'll have to give on that at some point, but exactly how it will is going to be one of those terrible things we await.
The only thing I'd add to that, I think that the one thing, in 1968, the divisions in the Democratic Party were incredibly stark. They were over the war in Vietnam, and you had Democrats who didn't want to vote for Hubert Humphrey. I think for legitimate reasons didn't want to vote for him because of his support for the war in Vietnam. The divisions between Clinton and Sanders are so minor in comparison. And in a lot of ways, the story of this election, I think, is sort of that the Sanders campaign had. I think we don't see it because how angry the Sanders campaign became. The Democratic Party is relatively united on most issues. There are not major divides in the party that we're used to seeing in the Democratic Party. But I think you're right that without any kind of breakthrough in Congress, you're not going to see. You're going to see this kind of anger boil up. But one thing that I think is positive for Democrats is they're much more united. There's not a southern wing anymore Democratic Party. There's basically a liberal wing Democratic Party, and there's a few outliers to that liberal wing, Heidi Heitkamp in South Dakota and Joe Manchin, but that's basically it. And it's a pretty united party, and if Democrats, were to win the House and Senate, I think you'd see an extraordinary amount of legislative action going forward. You won't, of course, since if Republicans hold on to the House, but I think there's much more unity in the party than people realize.
Yeah, I would have to say I disagree slightly about the extent to which the Sanders platform and Clinton's sort of agenda are in sync, or that there's little that divides them. I actually think he's far, far, far more of a kind of popular front, progressive in a way that Clinton is simply not. However, I think that, is there going to be a realignment? I think the problem is that the primary issues, once you get to the general election, what we've had happening is that Clinton, despite the fact that Sanders and those folks who supported him managed to make a very progressive Democratic Party platform, Clinton has been now reaching out, of course, to Republicans, and quite successfully. And what does that mean for what's going to happen when she comes to office is not entirely clear. But If the agenda of the more progressive kind of Sanders agenda in terms of debt relief for students, in terms of health care, more accessible health care for more Americans or all Americans, if those sort of the income inequality in a fundamental way, infrastructure, public investment, if all of those things are not really addressed, I think we're in exactly what Carol is. It's a crisis. There's a crisis moment, and the crisis has been revealed in these two kind of, I would say, kind of somewhat insurgent campaigners, let's say, at least in terms of how their parties perceived of them. And I don't know. Historians are terrible at prognosis, so I don't know. Who knows what will happen? But I think it is a sort of a crisis moment.
I thought, given how well Bernie did, and he did do extraordinarily well, Elizabeth Warren might have done even better. It's possible. It's a big what if, and Joe Biden as well. Next question. Yes, sir. And why don't we say 2 more, Carol? Does that sound about right? Okay.
Oh, thank you. I'm intrigued by the several expressions of how our system seems to have broken down. And we've also had 16 months, I think it is, of this crazy process to elect a president, and then another 3 months. And one has to ask if our entire method of doing this is breaking down. And I know it sounds like an incredible dream or fantasy that it might go back to where the English are, where you ask, who is the party here? Is it Koch? Is it, we don't even know who the party is, but in England we do know that it is the parliamentary members, and if the leader in the parliament doesn't have his backing, he's out in 2 months, 60 days, 40 days, 60 days, maybe 3 months, I don't know. Any thoughts on this?
So one of the things is that we have a checks and balances system, and the British have a winner-take-all. So if we were to have a party win an election and control the legislative branch, and from there appoint the president, we would certainly get a lot more done. But it would it would permit there to be much greater swings in what we were getting done. But you could go and suggest reforms along a slightly different line, and that is that the British have a 6-week election, and all the advertising is is part of what the radio and television must provide as part of their right to broadcast. So if you said that all the advertising was free and equal, and you had a 6 weeks campaign, you would get around the capacity, you would get largely around the capacity of the very wealthy or the corporations to dominate the election by simply being able to raise as a way of returning the power to the people and letting the human voice speak more loudly. And it would also just spare us the agony. But it would require journalists to really get their act together and find the dirt on people quickly.
What? Okay, I'm going to defend journalists right here because we got plenty of dirt on Donald Trump. I wrote plenty of pieces that pointed out Donald Trump was racist, and Republican voters don't care. But it's the reason, in part, I think why Donald Trump is so unpopular and has been for the past year. I actually am going to defend even though I will tell you that I've covered this campaign since last year for 2 years. I've written hundreds of stories about it. I hate this campaign. I literally never want to think about it again. But I think it's actually a pure example of democracy at work, because both parties have chosen the two figures in the party who were most popular and had the greatest support. And so as a small d Democrat, I think it's actually been positive in that way, I suppose. And I just on the parliamentary thing, look, we have a parliamentary system, unfortunately, in this country. We didn't, in the sense that the parties vote as blocks, right? So we used to have a system in which, in '68, you had Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats, and they didn't always agree, and certainly on race didn't agree at all. You had Northern Republicans and Southern Republicans. You had different elements of the party. You have today basically Democrats, Republicans voting on as a block. And I actually get to this point earlier that the dysfunction in our political system is because of that. Because even if Hillary Clinton is the most progressive person in the world, she can't pass anything with a Republican Congress. And I actually think, where I'm going to criticize both Trump and Sanders in this thing, I think both of them have had really pernicious influences on the way we think about compromised American politics. I mean, not just Trump. I shouldn't say that. Republican Party in general treats any kind of compromise with Democrats as the cardinal sin, right? You've seen Republicans from Eric Cantor to to a whole bunch of folks going back to 2010 punished for even considering compromising with Democrats. But then then you also have Hillary Clinton's be elected president probably, almost certainly, and she'll have a Republican House, and she'll be forced to work with Paul Ryan. But the way this primary played out, the notion that she would work with Republicans because of the arguments of Sanders and others and acting like a pragmatic politician has become like a four-letter word in the Democratic Party. It's become something you shouldn't do. And I think that's even more recipe for dysfunction. I mean, we need to get back to a situation in which Democrats and Republicans work together. And both the extremes of the two parties, I think, have made that virtually impossible. And I think for Hillary Clinton, make it, if she has a Republican House, make it almost impossible for her to be a successful president for her first term, which may only have one term.
Next question. Why don't we'll take two more. So this one and then one more.
Thank you very much. I kind of feel that this election, and similar with the Brexit vote in the UK, so I'm asking about whether this election and the Brexit referendum in the UK seem to be dominated by or marked by political spin, gamesmanship, or lies. And I'm wondering if that is something that is like new to this election, and if it's like a new dawn, the new reality, or if it has a historical legacy.
Well, I mean, not to contradict you, but I think there's also something that lies behind that, which is that both Britain and the United States are undergoing huge social change. And as a result, you have a reactionary response, which is to want to sort of go back in time and return to when it all felt good, way back when. And that is certainly, there have certainly been other times in the past, and that I think you could call the secession of the southern states when Lincoln was elected as a kind of reactionary response to the change that they saw coming that they just were not going to go along with. And so it's like, let's stop the clock. Let's actually, disappear into our fantasy of the past where, we felt good about ourselves. You guys probably know the exact moment, but, the white America is going to become a minority within America, and that is very upsetting to a lot of people. The loss of industrial America is very upsetting to a lot of people. And I think the similar things were going on in England. So I think it was profoundly emotional.
So I think that's exactly right to point out the substance behind and there is a way, what you're pointing to is that those sentiments can be manipulated. And so that's what you're sort of emphasizing. But sort of there's an emphasis on sort of manipulating the fears and anxieties of folks. But the reality is, I think that what's behind Brexit far more than that are these fundamental shifts, political economic shifts in the global world order, and the sense of American decline, right? And the real sort of thinning out of the middle class in both places, and those folks who feel like they've lost out from world trade, from the EU, et cetera, from globalization. I think that is at the core of explaining why we have now somebody like Trump, or why we have had Boris Johnson and Brexit.
I'm going to offer a positive note. Okay, so in 1992, 87% of the American electorate was white. In 2016, 70% will be white. And the 30% that's non-white is going to vote probably 80-20, 85-15 for Hillary Clinton and against Donald Trump. And the positive I find here is that you have a situation which you have a pure racist and nativist candidate, a misogynist candidate, a candidate who is running on white anxieties and white fears and using that. And he's going to lose badly. He's going to lose by double digits. Now, it's on one hand, it's kind of horrendous that he'll do as well as he will do, right? He'll get 38, 40, maybe 42%, maybe even higher of the vote, okay? But he'll lose. And what that says to me is that America evolving into a multicultural society, a more tolerant and diverse society, this election, in a sense, will confirm that. Because you couldn't have a more pure choice between the two candidates this year. And it's funny, none of us have mentioned the fact that we're about to elect the first female president in American history. It's weird how that seems to get forgotten in this campaign.
Yeah, it's true.
So I look at it in a way, the defeat of Trumpism, even though it won't go away, but the defeat of him in this election as a positive, very positive.
I like your positivity. I like your.
I need something.
I like your certainty that the election will go the way you said it will go, and I think you're probably right, but I still feel anxiety. But I feel some anxiety, to go back to the Brexit, that we've lost some luster already, just that all of this has happened. You know, it has not made democracy look very attractive. I think the British are doing a lot of soul searching now also. And things that were casually said by Donald Trump, like we might rethink NATO. If Poland gets attacked, we might not even defend Poland. You know, they were troubling. And the great leader of a great alliance doesn't say things like that. And so I think we need to shore up what it means to be the greatest country on earth. We're a little bit uncomfortable saying that kind of a thing, but I think we need to. I think the world community needs leadership more desperately than it ever has. And so if the United States can't step up, I fear for the world. And we've, you know, on a daily basis, we see troubling signs in foreign policy that the U.S. is not respected the way it used to be. And there's a very populistic president of the Philippines named Duterte, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it, who said terrible things about Barack Obama and about his mother, more specifically, and is in China this week trying to broker a new arrangement, a new alliance of some sort between China and the Philippines, which reverses a lot of American history. So these are big stakes, and Donald Trump is sort of a clown, and we all are, you know, are easily entertained by him, but these are very large stakes. Do we have one last question? Yes, sir.
I want to ask about the elephant in the room. Not race, although that usually is the elephant in the room in questions about American politics. But, and it probably very much is this time. But no, the elephant in the room with regard to presidential elections is the Electoral College. Of the 4 elections that the panelists discussed, the only one it really was in one of its regular crises in was 1860. 1824, of course, 1876, and most memorably for us in this room, 2000, it was also. But 1860, it was really broke. I mean, you mentioned that Lincoln only won because it was a 4-way race. Lincoln won 39.6% of the popular vote. The fact is, if you combine the other 3, Lincoln still wins. Only 4 winners have ever won 60% of the popular vote. And Duggan Ridgell would have won 60% of the popular vote and lost because Lincoln won 50%. He would have lost only the Pacific Coast votes if you combined the other 3, the 7 votes from California and Oregon. So the question, I guess the question is, since it happens every 30 or 40 or 50 years, the electoral vote gives us a 2000 or an 1860, thank God, or an 1876. Will it endure? There was a time when I was younger and more radical that I thought it had to go. Can it endure? Should it endure? What a strange way we have to pick our winners, and is that okay?
Well, I think it goes back to something that was said earlier, which is that this was a democracy, an experiment in democracy that had a lot of hedges against popular democracy. And I think the fear of the mob informed the founders quite heavily. And a lot of where Ted was going were these questions about, party reform, which again have these questions of, do we leave it up to the primaries, or do we find ourselves sort of missing the boys in the back room at this point? I mean, quite clearly, they would not have come up with 11 candidates, and that might easily have helped edge Trump out. It may be that Trump could not have made it except in a field with 11 candidates. So, how can we be advocating reform of the party process to tighten it up when we actually have this larger issue of an electoral college, which is got a kind of stranglehold and is in the, you can find yourself feeling very ambivalently about it. So I wouldn't dare to predict where it would go. But maybe you guys have a.
I mean, I'm deeply ambivalent for the exact reasons. If we claim to be a democracy, then the Electoral College is really it's sort of that stage of making us a republic. It undermines, in a way, a sense of pure democracy. Is it going to be reformed out of existence? I doubt it. I don't see any real sense of concern in popular discourse over the Electoral College. A colleague of mine, Alex Kaiser, is writing a book on the history of the Electoral College. Maybe he will provide with us some more illumination about the possibilities of reform or reforming it out of existence. But it doesn't seem to me that is in the realm of possibility.
Well, the one thing, you're not going to change it formally, but there's the popular vote movement, which relies on state legislatures supporting popular vote, basically to observe the popular vote when allocating electoral votes. I think it's maybe 13 or 14 states it's been passed in, and it certainly is something that could pick up steam and be something that would be, I forget the number of states. It doesn't have to be all the states. A certain number have to agree to this for this to happen. But I mean, like I think the larger point is that our democracy was created to basically stop things from being accomplished. It's basically anti-reform, it's anti-progressive, it's anti-democratic. We have a terrible, we think of ourselves as the greatest country in the world. We have the worst political system ever created. And Carol's exactly right, created to to be anti-democratic on purpose. So they're to me, Electoral College is like almost a very small issue. I mean, get rid of the Senate. That would be the best reform. I'm serious. Get rid of the Senate. It's a disaster. It's the biggest impediment to reform in this country that exists. Of course, you're never going to get rid of the Senate. But if you wanted to change things, that's where I would start. That's my pipe dream.
I think we just got our soundbite. I just want to say the Electoral College probably favors red state America a little over blue state America, but it also gives a reason for tiny states to exist. And I'm from both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. I grew up in both states, and it is somewhat amazing to me that Rhode Island even exists, to be honest. And
that is a soundbite right there, I'm afraid.
That Rhode Island has 2 senators, and it's stronger with an electoral college than without one. So there are some reasons that are important for regional identification. And in 1824, maybe it broke down, but the people were able to elect the person they wanted 4 years later. In 2000, you can't quite say that. But so on that inconclusive note, thank you all. Thank our panelists, Carol, Bundy, Lisa McGiir, Michael Cohen. Wonderful night. Thank you so much.